live from the Lakehouse. I'm Ari Kaplan, the segment's host and lead evangelist at Databricks. The theme for this year's summit is Generation AI, and so this is the segment. We have two of the world's experts on large language models, generative AI. So you're tuned into the right place if that's of interest to you. So let me introduce both of you. Harrison Chase, the founder of LangChain, one of the popular companies in this space, so thrilled to have you. And Nicolas Palaez, who works with me in tech marketing. So why don't you say quick introductions to yourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I can go first. My name's Harrison, co-founder and CEO of LangChain, open source framework for developing language model applications. And so just trying to make it as easy as possible for everyone out there to develop end-to-end applications powered by language models.
Yeah, and I'm Nick Palaez. I've worked at Databricks for 2 years, and I spent 6 years as a full-stack developer kind of seeing AI in practice, monitoring fleets of jet engines, and so it's kind of awesome seeing how it's evolved, especially in the past couple of years.
Great, and you might have seen Nick earlier when we did the opening in the general session, but Nick and I have worked closely together. We're actually on the same team, and large language models, we know it's of big interest here, but when Databricks did our first webinar, Nicolas was behind the scenes. He does a lot of demos for us, but it was pretty well attended, right?
Yeah, so we did 3 sessions all over the world, and actually something we were chatting about just before is that we ended up getting 900 questions over the course of the 3 webinars we did. And so the appetite for anything about knowledge about LLMs is just off the charts. So excited to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it was like the most populated webinar we'd ever did in history. And then we've since done LLMs, in notebooks, in Databricks, which made it super easy, which we'll get to. But Harrison, you are one of the early people in LLMs, meaning, 8 months ago?
Yeah.
But stable diffusion. Tell us, when did you come up with this? What does LangChain do?
Yeah,
all that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So LangChain started and still is an open source Python package. We've since added kind of like TypeScript and JavaScript support. But it basically started where I was chatting with a bunch of folks in the space. People were building applications. This was in October-ish of last year. So after Stable Diffusion, before ChatGPT, companies like Jasper and Copy were out there. They were building with generative models. A lot of what they were doing was generation of text. And so I think the next step is starting to use language models to start to reason and take action and interact with other things besides just the information that's in their weights. And so I think talking to a lot of folks in the space, saw some common abstractions of early startups, early hackers who were doing things, factored it out as a side project, very technical kind of like start, just factored out some common abstractions, and went from there. And I think the whole space has obviously exploded since. And so it's just been a lot of fun to be along for the ride.
And I'm kind of curious to get your take on something. So, a lot of people have been laser focused on the next latest and greatest model, but do you see going into the future that it's really going to be one model that rules them all, or do you really think it's going to be more complicated than that?
I think I definitely don't think it's going to be one model that rules them all. I think it's going to be no one really knows, so this is all speculation.
Fair.
I think I think there'll always be a few private models that are better than there'll be a few private models that are very good, and then a long tail of open source, and also maybe some other private models that aren't quite as good. And I think there's a time and place for both. I don't think that means that one's better than the other. I don't think that means that everyone will use public or everyone will use private. I think it's a time and place. I don't know. What do you think? Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me at least, what I've seen is that you don't always need some massive, super powerful model, especially if what you're really doing is more piecemeal. So if you really just need to summarize or get a sentiment of something, I mean, GPT-4 is incredible, right? But you may not need it. And so once people, I think, start realizing that compute isn't that cheap, especially if you're self-hosting it, then they might start thinking of more efficient ways. And also as things like LangChain have come about, which make it easier to actually glue these things together, it's really interesting to see how it's going to evolve in the sense that you might start getting distributed more specific models, and then you'll get that glue in the middle that I think is going to be a really interesting space to watch.
So I think there's this journey that people have in their minds of maybe starting from a general model And then as you kind of like evolve over time, maybe you don't want to use that because you don't have control over the data. It's too costly. The latency is too high. And you've kind of like figured out what you want to do. And so you move into that narrow specialized model. I also, like one thing that I'm really curious about though is like as the open source models start to get better and better, they will be good at some general tasks. One of the huge unlocks of OpenAI and other kind of like private models though, is the fact it's just behind an API. Like it's so easy to get started with. And yes, like, compute's not that expensive. It's getting easier and easier and you guys are pushing that forward, but it's still way easier to just call an API. So how do you see that going forward?
Well, I think that's a really good point, right? I think that ChatGPT really did something awesome, which because it's so easy and behind an API, and you don't need to know anything about all the models behind the scenes. You just ask it a question.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, you see the magic appear in front of you. I think that's incredible. And I think that as we go forward, other people will start democratizing that, right? So instead of just having a proprietary LLM behind the scenes or a mixture of them, right? I think that people will be able to start building out their own. And once platforms get simple enough, and something we're definitely trying to do here at Databricks, where we've abstracted the difficulty away, and we bring that simple solution to somebody where it's like, look, you don't need to know how all the fine tuning works. You just need to know how to ask it a question in layman's terms, and you get something incredible back. I think that's going to be awesome. But to me, it's really interesting seeing things like LangChain that make that happen, right? They are that glue, that kind of bridge. And so that kind of leads me to another question, which is like, what led you to come up with LangChain? Like, what are the problems that you saw that kind of you're like, I think we can improve on this?
So it was really about factoring out some abstractions, but I think like the problems that those abstractions were trying to solve are still the problems that LangChain tries to solve, which is basically just the language model is one piece of a large system. And so for the early companies, the language model kind of was the system and was the product in some sense. Like you'd have kind of like, I think the initial, Jasper offering was like writing copy, and it's probably it was basically a call to the language model. Mm-hmm. But then you start seeing all these other applications start popping up, whether it's asking questions of your documents, where yes, you could fine tune, but more often than not, it's some retrieval augmented generation approach where you're first doing an ingestion process to load all the documents, chunk them, pass them to an embedding model, put them in a vector store, and then at runtime, you're creating another embedding, maybe doing some post-processing tricks, passing it in through a prompt, and then interacting with SQL was one that was popping up. So like language model to SQL query to execute that SQL, synthesize the results, and basically this whole I think a lot of what LangChain is kind of just a lot of the glue that connects all these things with the reasoning, with the language model as the reasoning engine at the center of it. And I forget where I first heard the term reasoning engine. That's not me. That might have been Sam Altman. But I think that is the general problem it's trying to solve. It's just language models are one piece, just like compute is one piece of an application.
Right.
Database is one piece of an application.
Yep.
I think we're going to go to a place where language models are just one piece of an application, and so there'll be infrastructure needed around everything to glue everything together.
Yeah, and we have the time's just flying by about 2 minutes. One thing we were talking about, LLM ops, that's kind of one of the next things with these companies adopting so many different, protocols and APIs. How do you operationalize it all?
I think okay. So my background's in ML ops, so I've thought about this a lot, and I think a lot of ML ops and honestly some of the LLM ops offerings out there are kind of once it's in production, what happens then around monitoring and stuff like that. My personal take on it is we're still at a point where the biggest blocker is actually going from prototype to production in terms of reliability of the models and their performance, not necessarily in terms of cost and latency even, although those will definitely be a blocker at some point, but the models just aren't good enough. Yeah. And so I think I think LangChain as an open source framework is a first step in making that easier to kind of build things. But then for prototype to production, I think we're thinking a lot about that right now. I think everyone's thinking a lot about that right now. There's still kind of a gap there. And for the open source models, probably even more so would be my guess. But everything is just getting better at such a fantastic rate that.
Yeah. And so, we've got a ton of people watching that are super excited about this, where it's going. what do you see as kind of some interesting places for people that might want to dig in and kind of help develop, say, LangChain's an open source project. What would you like them to work on?
Yeah, I think one, honestly, probably just build things. Like, I think the amazing thing about generative models is they're so broad. And I think OpenAI has said this as well. Like, they just can't, the power of having everyone use it is they can do the applications that they knew best. So that would probably be my main thing. It's just, now is really the time to build. So
I love it.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Looking forward to hearing great things from you.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
It's great
and
to
Nicolas,
Hey.
thank you again for coming on.
Of course.
I love
Thanks
this.
for having us. Awesome.
Thank you all. And next we have Drew Banin, who is co-founder of one of our premier partners, DBT Labs. Drew, welcome.
How are you? Thanks for having me on.
You bet. How has your couple days been since you've been here?
Oh, it's been great. Bad weather on the East Coast, where I'm based out of in Philadelphia, but I found the good weather in between. I got here on time. It's been awesome seeing all the Databricks folks we work closely with, customers, partners. It's been a great event so far.
Great, yeah, and one of the things that's great about this event is Databricks, yes, is a large part of it, but it's really about the collaboration of the end users, of partners such as yourself, and employees, product leaders, the whole ecosystem. But a lot of people have heard of DBT Labs, but a lot haven't. So love to start off, what is DBT Labs? How did you come up with it?
Sure. So DBT Labs is the company that builds the product DBT. DBT is an open core framework for data modeling. So we think about it as bringing software engineering best practices to the analytics workflow. So kind of before DBT, we saw people writing SQL code. It was not version controlled or tested or documented. But with DBT, you can put this code into Git. You can test it. You can collaborate with your coworkers and kind of scale out the practice in a way that's really governed.
Oh, that's really cool. So, what would you say the better together story is? You have Databricks, not DBT, DBT, not Databricks.
Why is it better together?
Yeah, why do they complement?
Sure. So, DBT is all about this workflow. It's how you get in there and create data models. So, tables in a Lakehouse, for example, and then how you manage changes to them over time. So DBT does not execute this code itself. We sort of work with data platforms like Databricks to go and run this SQL or Python code and create objects in a data lake. So the better together story is that DBT really needs a data platform like Databricks to execute this code, and especially the performance characteristics of Databricks are really very stellar. And then on the other side, DBT really helps with creating these objects on the Databricks side. So being able to step in, address a new use case, you've ETL data into your data lake, but then combining different data sets together, testing your assumptions, documenting it, and really going from that bronze to silver to gold. DBT is the workflow you can employ to do that in a way that, again, is collaborative and governed and high quality.
Nice. We're talking, customer or use cases. What are some of your favorite, joint customers? Any case studies that you have?
Sure. I was actually just hearing about this. The Condé Nast team uses DBT on Databricks. And I think the stat I saw is that they can save 16 hours per data integration sprint on Databricks with DBT. So the ROI in terms of velocity and how quickly you can create these new use cases and address them with DBT has been stellar, but then also doing it with the quality. Because if it's fast but incorrect, it's not actually useful.
Right.
So the combination of fast and correct DBT and Databricks, it's definitely better together.
And also, it sounds like the cost effectiveness as well. Fast is improvement in time, but then also faster and bigger performance, but less cost as well.
Yeah, great. That's it.
Yeah. So any other customer examples? I know we have Zurich Insurance.
Oh,
and
sure.
Disney and
there's
others.
There's a lot of good examples. I think the one I met with at this conference previously was Chick-fil-A.
Oh, yeah.
And so I know that they do a ton of fascinating things with data, and I know Databricks is a huge part of that story. So we're really grateful for a lot of the folks that trust DBT to help run these workloads on Databricks. Yeah,
Chick-fil-A, they specifically reached out for me before the conference, trying to meet up with them here as well.
Yeah.
So let's look next year or so. What do you see in the whole data market?
Oh, sure. Well, gosh, the keynote this morning was fascinating, and I think it's hard to not talk about LLMs and generative AI. we're excited to see exactly how that progresses in the field in general, and we think we have really good ideas of how to bring that into the DBT workflow as well. We think it's finally time for semantic layers, so we're gearing up to launch our semantic layer. We acquired a company called Transform back in February, and we're working on this integrated DBT plus Transform semantic layer. So really looking forward to that, and we think there's a good tie-in with large language models for that product experience too.
Nice. So I just know that I don't know much about Transform.
Yeah.
How's that relating to LLM or other?
Oh, sure. So, a semantic model is all about mapping out the sort of data objects that you command in your Lakehouse or a data platform and how they map onto sort of the language that folks in the business use to talk about it. So, revenue has a very precise definition in data. The semantic model is all about sort of mapping these two things together. So when we think about LLMs and that kind of integration, it's going from a sort of written description of show me revenue, quarter over quarter, mapping that to data via the semantic model.
Yeah, I love a semantic layer benefit. Like you mentioned, revenue. One person within the same company could just be what was the money coming in, but you go to Best Buy or like some clothing store and people try on clothing at home and return it.
Oh, sure.
And before you know, someone else may say revenue is like coming in minus returns or after 60 days. So that's where the semantic layer is so important. After 60 days, don't count it as revenue or due. That the company has like a common term that it all works by.
Exactly. And this ends up being one of the big benefits of DBT is that it actually forces you to have these conversations in a cross-functional way. Right. So getting the right stakeholders in the room to define exactly what we mean by revenue or a marketing qualified lead or an activated user. Once you define it and codify it in version control, you now have a definition that everyone can point to as being, the truth.
Right.
And then inevitably that will evolve over time as organizations evolve and products evolve. And so it's a way that you can go in there and change that definition, have it updated in sort of all the different places that you query that metric or that entity over time.
Excellent. So I've traveled around the world. I love seeing customers and partners, and every single place that I've been at a Databricks conference, there's been DBT Labs. So appreciate the worldwide support. Do you travel much?
Oh gosh, I've been traveling a lot this year, actually. We think it's stellar. There's I don't know the number off my head, but many dozens of meetups across the world. Some of them we host, some of them are just purely community hosted, and we help support where we can. We think it's awesome. This community of practice, we call these folks analytics engineers. Mm-hmm. It's the people that really understand the data domain, but also have the technology skills to sort of write code and do so in a way that lives these software engineering best practices. And we estimate that there's like 80,000 plus folks in the DBT community across the world, which is just really stellar to see it grow from nothing over the past 7 years.
I was going to ask, so 7 years you started it?
Almost exactly 7 years ago, this month actually.
And how many co-founders do you have? How did you start thinking there might be a need and then you grow?
So there's 3 of us. We actually all worked at the same previous company together. And we saw the emergence of what we might call the modern data stack.
Yes.
So it was a data platform, a BI tool, a data integration tool, and this best of breed approach to modern analytics. And we noticed that there was really no product category around this data transformation process. So going from data that lands in a data platform, Lakehouse, to something that's ready to analyze in a BI tool, there's a lot in the middle there. So that was sort of the niche that we carved out with DBT. And working with the community, we got to see all the different ways in which there were opportunities to expand into, data quality, documentation, et cetera, and kind of grow DBT as a product over time.
Great. So the 3 co-founders, what area are you focused on?
Yeah, I'm in the product organization. So to be honest with you, I've always been kind of in the middle of a few different areas. I like spending time with community, going to meetups when I can.
Nice.
Definitely products, design, and engineering. Even though I shouldn't really be writing code anymore, I still do it sometimes.
Well, yeah, you proved your value, did the code to get it off the ground, and now you have a wonderful team to help make it all a reality. And yeah, glad to hear. So this is that you part of the community. Just wanted you to know there's 157 countries out there now. All of them know about DBT Labs. Any last words? We're wrapping up.
Thanks for tuning in. It was a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you having me on.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Best of luck.